Chapter 1. The Pallid Invitation. Rain slicked the cobblestones of Hemlock Lane, reflecting the weak gray light filtering between soot-stained tenements. Eleanor Vance adjusted the strap of her heavy satchel, pulling her coat tighter against the damp chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath her feet. She checked the crumpled address scrawled on a napkin one last time. Number 13, Hemlock Lane. It should be here. An archway, barely wider than a refuse cart, opened between a boarded-up pawn shop and a grimy pub belching stale beer fumes. Beyond the arch lay a narrow, forgotten courtyard choked with weeds and refuse. And there, dominating the enclosed space, stood the building. It wasn't merely old. It was ancient, a tumor of blackened brick and sagging timbers squatting under a perpetually overcast sky. Windows, like vacant eyes, were either boarded over or stared out with panes opaque layers deep in grime. A faded sign, barely legible, hung precariously above a pair of immense, warped wooden doors. Pendleton's Grand Anatomical Exhibition and Museum of Morbid Curiosities. Eleanor's contact, a twitchy rare books dealer named Abernathy, swore the place had been sealed for decades. Yet he'd procured a key, a monstrous thing of rusted iron heavy in her palm. Abernathy hadn't wanted to discuss how he obtained it, his eyes darting around his cluttered shop as he pressed it into her hand along with a crude map of the museum's supposed layout. His parting words echoed in her mind. "Place gives off bad air, Miss Vance. Proper bad air. Some things are best left buried in dust." Eleanor, writing her dissertation on the intersection of Gothic art and Victorian medical practices, saw only opportunity. Pendleton's was infamous, a footnote in obscure journals, rumored to house not anatomical specimens but uniquely grotesque waxwork tableaus alongside its notorious dissection theater. A sealed time capsule of morbid fascination. The iron key grated in the huge lock. Rust flaked away. With a groan of protesting metal, the mechanism turned. Eleanor put her shoulder to the door. It resisted, then gave way with a protracted screech, opening onto absolute darkness and the thick, cloying scent of decay, stale preservation chemicals, and something else. Something sickly sweet beneath the rot. She retrieved a sturdy flashlight from her satchel, its beam cutting a swathe through the oppressive black. The entrance hall was vast, coated in a uniform gray blanket of dust. Cobwebs hung like funereal bunting from unseen heights. The beam swept across faded velvet ropes, overturned display stands, and shattered glass. Directly ahead, a grand staircase curved upwards into shadow. To the left and right, archways promised further chambers. Eleanor stepped inside, the heavy door groaning shut behind her, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. The air was heavy, stagnant. Each footstep echoed, swallowed by the immense space. She swept the light across the nearest archway, revealing a sign, "Gallery of Affliction." Curiosity warred with a prickling apprehension running cold lines down her spine. She moved towards the gallery. The beam illuminated glass display cases, their contents obscured by grime. Between them stood figures shrouded in dusty white sheets, life-sized shapes, humanoid, motionless. Eleanor reached the first covered form, her breath hitched. Hesitantly she reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and grasped the edge of the sheet. She pulled. Dust billowed, Beneath stood a wax figure, a man gaunt, his skin rendered with appalling realism in pale, waxy tones. He clutched his chest, mouth open in a silent gasp. His clothes were period-accurate, threadbare, but it was the eyes that held her. Glass orbs, startlingly clear amidst the decay, fixed on something unseen in the distance. They seemed too bright, too aware. She moved the light to the next figure. A woman, seated, draped in rags, skin marked with disturbingly accurate lesions depicting, Eleanor guessed, smallpox. Again the eyes. Wide, starring, reflecting the flashlight beam with an unnerving intensity. They didn't seem painted on or merely inserted. They seemed to watch. Figure after figure, tuberculosis, cholera, gout, each rendered with meticulous stomach-churning detail, each with those piercing glass eyes, starring, always starring. The silence pressed in, broken only by her own breathing and the frantic thumping in her chest. She was alone. She repeated it mentally, completely alone. Yet the sensation of being observed intensified with every uncovered figure, a palpable pressure against her skin. She reached the end of the row, near a deeper archway leading further into the museum's depths. Her light touched another sheeted form, slightly smaller than the others. She pulled away the covering. This figure depicted a child, perhaps 7 or 8, consumed by fever, skin flushed, lips cracked. Its glass eyes were wide with depicted delirium. As her light rested on those eyes, a faint sound reached her. A soft, wet plink, then another plink, like water dripping. But the roof above seemed intact, coated in undisturbed dust. She swept the light around the child figure. There on the grimy floor beside its bare wax foot, a small, dark, viscous puddle was slowly forming. Something dripped from the corner of the figure's left eye. A thick, tear-like substance, dark as old blood. Plink! Eleanor took an involuntary step away, her flashlight beam wavering. The silence returned, thicker, heavier. The eyes of the figures seemed to follow her movement in the periphery. The air grew colder. Abernathy's warning surfaced again. Bad air. She swallowed hard against a rising nausea that had little connection to the gruesome depictions. The invitation felt less academic now, more sinister. The dust wasn't just covering history here. It felt like it was smothering screams. She backed slowly out of the gallery of affliction, the weight of countless glass eyes pressing against her retreating form. The main hall seemed less empty, the shadows deeper, more active. The massive front door suddenly seemed miles away. Chapter 2: Dust and Diagrams. Sunlight, thin and watery, failed to penetrate the grime-coated windows the following morning. Eleanor worked by the focused beam of her flashlight, and a powerful battery-operated lantern placed on a precarious stack of crates in what the crude map labeled the archival chamber. It was less a chamber, more a glorified closet adjacent to the main hall, crammed floor to ceiling with rotting wooden shelves overloaded with ledgers, boxes tied with decaying string, and rolled-up documents thick with the dust of ages. The air tasted of mildew and brittle paper. She had returned, driven by academic stubbornness that warred with the unease settling deep in her gut after the previous day's experience. The dripping eye, the sensation of being watched. She tried to rationalize it. Condensation, perhaps, the building settling, imagination running wild in the dark. The explanations sounded thin, even to herself. Carefully, she untied a bundle labeled Acquisitions and Provenance, 1871-885. The paper was fragile, threatening to crumble at her touch. She spread the top document under the lantern light. Lists of donations, purchases, preserved organs in jars, skeletal remains, surgical tools. Standard fare, morbidly fascinating. She scanned pages, her fingers gray with grime. Then an entry caught her attention. October 1878. Lot commissioned ocular prosthetics, superior grade, 40 pairs, supplier S. Croft, payment rendered. Below it, another entry. November 1878. Additional order ocular prosthetics as available. Urgency emphasized. Supplier S. Croft. S. Croft. The name meant nothing immediately but the specificity, superior grade. As available, urgency emphasized, struck her as odd for simple glass eyes. Weren't they mass-produced? She made a note. Further down, another bundle. Artist's Correspondence, E. Dubois. Evangeline Dubois. The wax artist Abernathy mentioned, renowned for her unsettling realism. Elinor gently unrolled a brittle letter. The handwriting was elegant, precise, yet conveyed a growing agitation across several entries. The commission's increase. Alastair demands ever more lifelike subjects. He provides the materials, the wax, the hair, even the eyes. He insists on these new eyes from Croft. They are remarkably clear, too clear, sometimes when the light catches them. The sentence trailed off. Another letter, dated months later. Cannot escape their gaze even when covered. I work late, the gaslight flickers, and I perceive movement where none exists. The figures in the affliction gallery. They watch me. Alastair dismisses my concerns. He praises the realism. He does not understand. The eyes hold. Again, unfinished. A dark stain like a tear or spilled ink marred the page. Elinor set the letters aside, a chill tracing the path of the remembered dripping from the child figure's eye. Alastair. That would be Dr. Alastair Finch, the museum's founder and chief anatomist. A brilliant surgeon, history recorded, but also arrogant and ruthless in his pursuit of anatomical knowledge. She moved deeper into the archive, flashlight beam dancing across shelves laden with rolled diagrams. Anatomical charts mostly. She unrolled one depicting the musculature of the human arm. Exquisite detail, penned with drafting precision. Another showed the nervous system, a delicate tracery of lines. Then she found a different set, tucked away, rendered in a slightly cruder, more urgent hand. Not printed diagrams, but sketches. They depicted figures, familiar figures, the consumptive man from the gallery, the smallpox woman, the feverish child. They weren't anatomical studies in the usual sense. Arrows pointed not to muscles or bones, but to points on the wax figures themselves. Notes scribbled in the margins were barely legible. Gaze intensifies under gaslight. Cold spot localized near left orbit. Audible weeping reported, source undetermined. These weren't official museum records. They read like field notes. Whose? Finch, Dubois, or someone else unnerved by the exhibits. Her light snagged on something metallic half buried under a pile of collapsed ledgers. She pried it loose. A small tin box rusted shut. Using the edge of her trowel from her fieldwork kit, she managed to force the lid. Inside, nestled on faded velvet lining, were several pairs of glass eyes. identical to the ones in the figures. Clear, perfectly formed. She picked one up. It was cool to the touch, heavier than expected. Holding it up to the lantern, she examined the iris, a swirl of blue unnervingly realistic. As she tilted it, the light shifted across its surface. For a fraction of a second, the reflection wasn't the dusty archive, wasn't her own face peering back. It was a distorted image, a cramped, dark space, rough wooden planks, the brief, terrified visage of a man she didn't recognize, mouth open in a silent scream. Alina dropped the eye. It rolled across the floorboards, coming to rest against a pile of discarded papers, its blue iris seeming to stare directly at her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She snatched her hand away, rubbing her fingers together as if burned. It was a trick of the light, the curved surface, the grime, the lantern. Yet the image had been sharp, detailed. She scanned the archive, the weight of observation pressing down again, heavier this time. Was it just the building, the silence, her imagination fueled by Dubois' frantic letters? Or was something else here, cataloging her intrusion alongside the dusty relics? The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, the piles of forgotten documents resembling hunched, waiting forms. The simple act of breathing felt laborious. She gathered the S. Croft notes and Dubois' letters, stuffing them into her satchel. The tin box remained on the floor, the single blue eye tracking her departure from the cramped, suffocating archive. The gallery outside waited, silent and watchful. Chapter 3: Whispers in Wax. Days bled into a week. Alina established a routine, albeit one punctuated by gnawing apprehension. She set up a small work table in the main hall, using battery-powered lamps against the oppressive gloom. The archive yielded more fragments, ledgers detailing exorbitant costs for preserving chemicals, cryptic notes about specimen acquisitions from dubious sources, mentions of public dissections drawing huge, morbid crowds. Dr. Finch's ambition seemed matched only by his apparent lack of scruples. But it was the presence of Madame Dubois that grew more defined, less easily dismissed. It wasn't a visible apparition, not yet. It was a collection of subtle disturbances centered around the wax figures, particularly those in the gallery of affliction. A faint scent of lavender, incongruous amidst the decay, sometimes lingered near the figure of the consumptive man. Tools Alina left on her table would be found moved slightly overnight, closer to the entrance of the gallery. Once she heard a faint sigh, seemingly emanating from the direction of the smallpox woman, a sound so soft it could have been the building settling, yet filled with an undeniable sadness. Alina found more of Dubois' writings tucked into a ledger detailing wax imports. These were looser, more frantic. He brings them still, Croft. Finch accepts them without question. Eyes that see too much, eyes that weep. I tried to refuse, but Alistair, he insists. Perfection, he calls it. Abomination, I whisper. The child, the feverish one. It cries at night. Not wax tears now, real sorrow. I hear it in my sleep. The entry solidified Alina's resolve to re-examine the weeping figure. Armed with her flashlight and a growing sense of dread, she entered the gallery of affliction. The figures stood as before, silent sentinels in the gloom. The air here remained colder, the silence more profound. She approached the feverish child. The puddle beneath its foot was gone, evaporated or perhaps soaked into the grimy floorboards. Yet the dark track running from the corner of its left eye remained, stark against the pale wax cheek. She leaned closer, shining the light directly into the glass orb. It was a deep brown, intricately detailed. As she watched, she perceived an infinitesimal shimmer within its depths, a distortion that wasn't merely a reflection. A sudden, intense wave of misery washed over her. Not her own emotion, but an invasive, crippling sorrow, immense and suffocating. It felt ancient, profound, the distilled grief of a long illness, the terror of delirium, the helpless longing for comfort that never came. Tears pricked Eleanor's own eyes, hot and unexpected. She gasped, stumbling back, the feeling receding as she put distance between herself and the figure. Her heart pounded. It wasn't just a dripping eye. It was an outpouring, an emotional residue leaking into the physical world. Shaken, she turned to leave, sweeping her light across the other figures. Had the consumptive man's head tilted slightly towards her? Was the shadow beside the smallpox woman deeper, somehow more defined than before? Paranoia, she told herself, induced by the oppressive atmosphere and the child figure's disturbing effect. As she reached the archway back to the main hall, a distinct sound echoed from behind her. A soft, scraping noise, like wax dragging lightly across wood. Eleanor froze. Slowly she turned back, directing her flashlight beam into the gallery. The figures stood motionless, identical positions, unchanged. Yet the scraping sound had been undeniable. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Only the frantic beat of her own pulse against her eardrums. She backed out of the archway, keeping the light trained on the silent inhabitants of the gallery. Had one of them moved? Or was something else stirring within the room, something obscured by the displays? She scanned the periphery, the corners draped in heavy shadow. Nothing. Later that afternoon, while trying to decipher a water-damaged manifest near her work table, she heard it again. A soft thud from the direction of the grand staircase leading to the upper floors where the anatomical theater resided. Then silence, followed by a faint, rhythmic tap, 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 coming from the darkness above. She directed her flashlight beam upwards. The stairs ascended into impenetrable blackness. The tapping stopped. The air grew heavy again, charged with anticipation. Whatever resided in this building, it was aware of her, and it was beginning to stir. The whispers weren't just in Dubois' frantic letters anymore. They were in the air, in the settling dust, in the cold spots that lingered near the lifelike figures crafted by a tormented artist, and they were calling from the darkness upstairs. Chapter 4, the seventh subject. The tapping from the upper floor ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving a silence that felt more menacing than the sound itself. Eleanor spent the rest of the day consolidating her notes, her mind replaying the scraping sound from the gallery, the sorrow radiating from the child figure, the rhythmic tapping from above. The museum wasn't just a repository of morbid history. It was a container, holding echoes, grief, and something watchful. Her research kept circling back to the anatomical theater. According to records, it was the centerpiece of Finch's establishment, public dissections performed for medical students and paying spectators alike. Ethical considerations were secondary to the spectacle. She found lists of cadavers procured, some donated, some unclaimed, some with origins deliberately obscured. And then, repeated mentions of Subject 7. No name, no origin, just a number assigned to a body used for a particularly popular series of demonstrations in the winter of 1879. Finch's notes praised the excellent state of preservation and the intriguing cranial structure. The next morning, Alina decided to investigate the upper floor. The grand staircase groaned under her weight, each step stirring clouds of dust that danced in her flashlight beam. The air grew colder as she ascended, carrying the metallic tang of old blood overlaid with the ever-present chemical smell. The landing opened onto a wide, shadowed corridor. Doors lined either side, presumably leading to preparation rooms or private studies. At the far end, imposing double doors marked the entrance to the theater itself. One of the doors hung slightly ajar. Hesitantly, she pushed it open. The anatomical theater was cavernous. Tiers of wooden benches curved steeply upwards, surrounding a central pit. In the pit, under a grime-coated skylight that admitted only a faint gray illumination, stood the dissection table. A slab of stained marble, scarred and pitted, mounted on a heavy iron base. Straps lay coiled upon it. Surgical instruments, rusted scalpels, saws, clamps lay scattered on a nearby trolley as if abandoned mid-procedure. The silence here was different. Not empty, but expectant. The weight of countless gazes seemed to linger, focused on the central slab. Alina walked slowly down the steep steps towards the pit, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. She ran her hand over the cold marble, imagining Finch working here, the audience packed into the tiers above, a gruesome spectacle unfolding under the gaslights. Her attention snagged on something near the base of the table. Scratches in the floorboards, deep and frantic, as if someone had clawed at the wood. And dark stains, almost black, soaked deep into the grain. She circled the table, her light probing the shadows. Against the far wall of the pit stood several more figures, these distinct from the waxworks below. They were anatomical models, plaster and wood, some bisected to show musculature, others with removable organs. Beside them, almost hidden in shadow, was one more wax figure. It was different from those in the gallery. Male, dressed in rough, plain clothes. Its features were coarse, deliberately unremarkable, yet rendered with Dubois' chilling realism. It wasn't depicting a disease, but seemed intended as an example of something else. Phrenology, criminal anthropology. Its placard was missing. What struck Alina most were its eyes. A startling, pale gray fixed directly forward with an unnerving intensity. She felt a pull towards it, a morbid curiosity mingled with dread. This figure felt charged, different. Remembering Dubois' distress and the S. Croft entries, she approached cautiously. This must be one of the later figures, fitted with those superior-grade eyes Finch insisted upon. Standing before it, she raised her flashlight, centering the beam on its face, specifically on the pale gray eyes. They seemed to absorb the light, reflecting nothing back. She leaned closer, tracing the lines etched around them, the simulated pores in the wax. Without warning, the world tilted. The air thickened, vibrating. A roar filled her ears, not of sound, but of raw, incoherent fury. The theater vanished, replaced by a rapid-fire sequence of images, searing themselves onto her mind's eye. A courtroom, harsh voices, a gavel striking wood, faces sneering, judging. Her own hands, no, not hers, rougher, calloused, bound. A dark alley, rain, a struggle, a flash of steel, a different man's face twisted in malice. The dissection table, cold marble against bare skin, straps biting tight, Finch's face looming above, clinical, detached, the murmur of the crowd. A blinding pain behind the eyes, not physical but a violation, a sense of self being extinguished, overwritten. Rage, pure, helpless, consuming rage, trapped. Eleanor cried out, staggering backward, tripping over a loose floorboard and crashing onto the dusty tier seats. Her flashlight clattered away, plunging the theater into near darkness, save for the faint gray light from the skylight above. Her head spun, nausea churning in her stomach. The images faded, but the rage remained, an alien echo thrumming within her chest. She scrambled for the flashlight, her hand shaking uncontrollably. Its beam sliced through the gloom, landing back on the wax figure. It stood unchanged, impassive, its pale gray eyes staring straight ahead. Subject 7, it had to be, not just a representation but somehow linked. The eyes weren't just glass, they were containers, holding the final moments, the final emotions, the raw fury of the man dissected on that table. A man perhaps wrongly accused, his identity erased, his body subjected to public spectacle, his final violation the theft of his sight, now starring out from a wax effigy. The rage wasn't entirely gone. It resonated within her, a low, dangerous hum. She felt an urge, primal and terrifying, to lash out, to destroy the figure, to shatter those watching eyes. She forced herself to breathe, pushing the foreign emotion down. A floorboard creaked softly on the tier above her. Eleanor froze, snapping the flashlight beam upwards. Empty benches stared back, draped in shadow, silence, but she wasn't alone. Subject 7 wasn't the only presence here. The weight of observation returned, tenfold, cold and calculating. Something had witnessed her connection with the figure. Something approved of the rage. The theater held more than just memories. It held consciousness, fragmented and malevolent. And she had just announced her sensitivity to its influence. Chapter 5, Shattered Reflections. The encounter with Subject 7 left Eleanor deeply unsettled. The visceral experience, the borrowed rage, it was undeniable proof that the phenomena in the museum were not mere tricks of light or products of her imagination. The eyes were conduits, but to what or whom remained terrifyingly unclear. She avoided the anatomical theater for the next 2 days, focusing her efforts on the less overtly hostile archive, though even there the air felt charged, watchful. She worked with her back to the door, jumping at every creak of the ancient building. Sleep offered little respite, filled with fragmented visions of staring eyes and echoing footsteps in the dark. The new manifestation began subtly. While examining a display case in the main hall, one containing rusty surgical implements, she caught her reflection in the grimy glass. For a fleeting instant, the face looking back wasn't hers. The eyes were wider, filled with a stark terror, the mouth stretched in a silent scream. She blinked, recoiled, and her normal reflection returned, pale and wide-eyed itself. She dismissed it as fatigue, a morbid projection. It happened again later that day. She was cleaning a small, oval mirror she'd found in what might have been Finch's private study. Hopping its frame might offer clues. As the grime cleared, her reflection appeared, but it lingered a fraction of a second too long when she turned away. And its expression, it wasn't mirroring her own focused frown, but wore a slight, unpleasant smirk. Elinor dropped the mirror, the silvered glass cracking across its surface. The phenomenon wasn't limited to mirrors or glass cases. She began catching glimpses in the polished surface of her thermos, in a puddle of stagnant water near the leaky entrance, even, horrifyingly, within the depths of the glass eyes of the figures themselves. Not the potent, memory-filled eyes of Subject 7 or the weeping child, but the standard, supposedly inert eyes of other figures. Her reflection would appear trapped within the orb, distorted by the curve, but always subtly wrong. Sometimes it wept silently. Sometimes it mouthed words she couldn't decipher. Often, it just stared back with an unnerving, predatory stillness, its expression chillingly devoid of her own mounting fear. This reflected watcher, as she began to think of it, was different from the sorrow of Dubois or the fury of Subject 7. It felt cold, calculating, and deeply personal. It fed on her fear, twisting her own image into a source of psychological torment. One evening, as dusk bled through the filthy windows, painting the main hall in shades of bruised purple and gray, Elinor was packing her notes. She straightened up, catching sight of her reflection in the darkened glass of a large display cabinet across the hall. It stood perfectly still, even though she was moving. Its head was cocked slightly, and a slow smile spread across its reflected face, chillingly unlike her own stressed expression. Elinor froze, her blood running cold. "Who are you?" she whispered, the sound swallowed by the vast space. The reflection didn't answer, but its smile widened. It raised her hand, and pointed deliberately towards the grand staircase leading to the anatomical theater. Panic seized Elinor. She grabbed her lantern, her satchel, and stumbled towards the main entrance, fumbling with the heavy iron key. Behind her she sensed, rather than saw, the reflection detaching itself from the glass, stepping out into the hall. She didn't dare verify her impression. Outside, the familiar gloom of Hemlock Lane felt almost welcoming compared to the focused malevolence she'd left behind. She leaned against the cold, damp brick wall, gasping for breath, her heart hammering. The reflections weren't passive. They were an entity or an aspect of the building's consciousness, using her own image against her, trying to guide her, to lure her. Where? Towards the theater, towards Subject 7's rage, or towards something else waiting in the darkness above. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. The museum wasn't just haunted, it was actively hostile, probing her weaknesses, using her senses against her. Every reflective surface was now a potential window for horror, every shadow a possible hiding place for something wearing her own face. Returning tomorrow seemed less like research, more like willingly stepping into a predator's cage. Yet the unanswered questions, the fate of Subject 7, the mystery of the eyes sourced by the elusive S. Croft, pulled at her academic curiosity even as raw fear screamed for her to abandon the cursed place forever. The reflection's pointing finger lingered in her mind, an invitation or a threat. Chapter 6: The Snatcher's Shadow. The lure of the unsolved mysteries, perhaps amplified by the subtle influence of the place itself, drew Alina back despite the terror induced by the reflected watcher. She returned armed with a renewed, albeit shaky, resolve and several extra flashlights. She decided to focus her investigation on S. Croft, the supplier of the cursed eyes. If the eyes were the source, understanding their origin was paramount. She returned to the archive, meticulously sifting through procurement ledgers and payment receipts, ignoring the unsettling feeling of being watched, not just by reflections, but by the oppressive weight of the building's history. She found more entries related to Croft, large sums paid for anatomical materials, transit costs from pauper graveyards, and discretionary fees. The picture forming was one of a body snatcher, a resurrectionist operating long after their heyday, supplying Finch not just with eyes, but likely with entire cadavers of dubious origin. As she examined a particularly brittle ledger detailing payments to Croft from 1879, the same year Subject 7 was dissected, the temperature in the cramped archive plummeted. Her breath plumed in the air. A distinct odor arose, sharp and unpleasant, grave dirt and cheap gin. It clung to the back of her throat. Alina held her breath, listening. A faint rustling sound came from the corner behind a stack of collapsing boxes, like old, stiff fabric brushing against wood. She aimed her flashlight beam. Nothing but shadows and debris. Yet the cold intensified, raising goosebumps on her arms. A low chuckle echoed in the small space, dry and rasping. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Alina spun around, heart pounding. Who's there? The rustling sound again, closer this time. A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom near the doorway. It wasn't solid, more like a distortion in the air, vaguely man-shaped, hunched and stooped. It emanated cold and that fetid graveyard smell. "Clever girl," the voice rasped, thick with a Cockney accent buried under years of spectral decay. "Poking round in Finch's mess. Shoulda left it buried." Alina scrambled backwards, pressing against the dusty shelves. "Silas Croft." The shadowy form solidified momentarily, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes and yellowed teeth pulled back in a grimace that might have been a smile. He wore rough, old-fashioned clothes, stained dark. "That's me, supplier of finest goods to the good doctor. Eyes, organs. Whole sets sometimes. Fresh off the slab or the gibbet or dug warm from pauper dirt. Finch paid well, never asked questions." The air vibrated with a mixture of spectral energy and something else, residual guilt, perhaps, curdled into malice. "Those eyes," Alina stammered, forcing the words out despite the icy fear gripping her. "Where did you get them? Subject 7's eyes." Croft's spectral form flickered. The chuckle returned, colder this time. "Finch wanted the best. Realistic, said the usual glass ones lacked. Soul." He drifted closer, the smell intensifying. "Found a German fella, odd bloke, said 'e could capture the last sight, trap it in the glass, paid IM pennies, sold 'em to Finch for pounds. Good business." He gestured vaguely with a shadowy hand. "As for 7, Finch add IM marked special. Wanted is peepers specific. Took 'em myself, I did." While E was still warm on the slab, fightin' type, E was angry. A wave of dizziness washed over Alina as Croft's words resonated with the fury she'd experienced in the theater. "You shouldn't be air," Croft hissed, his form darkening. "Disturbin' things, lettin' 'em out." The cold intensified, biting deep. Objects on the shelves rattled. A box tumbled down, spilling brittle papers. "They see you now. They all see you, through my eyes." His spectral shape surged forward, not attacking but seeming to pass through her. Alina gasped, enveloped in an unnatural cold that seeped into her bones, carrying the phantom stench of decay and the chilling echo of Croft's rasping voice inside her head. "Get out. Leave 'em be." Then he was gone. The cold receded slowly, leaving her shaking violently in the suddenly silent archive. The smell lingered, a nauseating reminder. Croft wasn't just a historical footnote. He was here, a gatekeeper of sorts, tied to the objects he procured, resentful of her intrusion. He wasn't the primary source of the malevolence, perhaps, but he was a part of it, his actions having provided the very conduits for the horrors trapped within the museum. And his warning felt chillingly genuine. "They all see you now, through my eyes." The reflected watcher, Subject 7, the weeping child, maybe even Finch himself. Her presence had disturbed a delicate, rotten equilibrium. Leaving was no longer a simple option. She was entangled. Chapter 7. The Sorrowful Tide. Silas Croft's spectral visitation left Alina deeply shaken, but also strangely focused. His confirmation of the eye's unnatural origin, the mention of a German craftsman who could trap the last sight, it shifted the horror from purely spectral to something more akin to contained, weaponized suffering. Croft's warning echoed constantly. "They all see you now." She felt the truth of it in the increased activity within the museum. Shadows seemed to cling closer. Footsteps echoed hers in empty corridors, and the sensation of being watched was now constant, emanating not just from the figures, but from the very walls. The reflected watcher became bolder, its appearances more frequent, its expressions shifting from mockery to outright hunger. Her attention returned to the gallery of affliction, specifically to the weeping child figure. The pervasive sorrow it emanated seemed to be intensifying, bleeding out into the surrounding environment. The air near it was perpetually cold and damp, and the dark, viscous tears were no longer just dripping. They formed a slowly expanding, slick patch on the floor around its base. The substance didn't evaporate. It lingered, glistening unnaturally in her flashlight beam. One afternoon, while carefully sketching the child figure from a distance, trying to document its state, Alina heard a faint, wet skittering sound. Her light darted towards the noise. Emerging from the dark puddle at the figure's base were small, slug-like creatures. They were the color of dried blood, glistening with the same viscous fluid as the tears, moving with surprising speed across the floorboards. Tear streakers, she mentally labeled them, recalling the list she'd compiled. They seemed drawn to warmth. Several headed directly towards her work lamp. Others crawled towards her, their eyeless forms undulating. Repulsion warred with a morbid need to observe. As one neared her boot, she saw tiny, needle-like teeth lining a circular mouth on its underside. She instinctively kicked it away, sending it tumbling back towards the puddle. More were emerging now, a dozen or more, spreading out from the weeping figure like an obscene tide. The sorrow emanating from the wax child intensified, pressing down on Alina, making her movements feel sluggish, her thoughts clouded with despair. She backed away slowly, using a fallen piece of wood to sweep the creatures aside as they advanced. They left trails of corrosive slime that sizzled faintly on the dusty floor. One crawled up the leg of her work table, heading for her notes. Another scaled the wall, defying gravity. The atmosphere grew heavy, saturated with grief. Alina felt an almost overwhelming urge to simply sit down, to succumb to the crushing sadness. She recognized the influence, fought against it. This was the figure's defense, or perhaps its way of spreading its misery. She retreated from the gallery, slamming a heavy internal door she found nearby, hopping to contain the slow advance of the tear streakers and the suffocating aura of sorrow. The thick oak shuddered slightly, as if something pushed against it from the other side. A faint, muffled weeping sound seeped through the wood. Leaning against the closed door, catching her breath, Alina realized the museum's horrors were becoming increasingly physical. Croft's spectral warnings, Subject 7's psychic assault, the reflected watcher's psychological warfare, and now, the weeping figure spawning tangible, hostile creatures and projecting debilitating emotion. The individual elements were coalescing, the threat escalating from subtle dread to active physical danger. The bad air Abernathy warned of was thickening, becoming toxic. Containing the sorrowful tide behind a door felt like a temporary, futile measure. Something larger was building, fed by the collective misery trapped within these walls. Chapter 8: Amalgamation. The museum grew perceptibly darker after Alina sealed the gallery of affliction, not just in terms of light but in atmosphere. A low hum, almost subsonic, seemed to permeate the building, punctuated by creaks, groans, and the occasional skittering sound from behind the sealed door. The reflected watcher became a near-constant presence, its distorted image flickering in every piece of glass, its silent mockery amplifying Alina's isolation and fear. Croft's spectral form sometimes manifested as fleeting shadows or icy patches of air, muttering warnings or curses. Alina knew she couldn't stay sealed off indefinitely. Her research felt secondary now to survival, yet the need to understand, to perhaps find a way to quell the building's torment, kept her there. She felt increasingly drawn towards the anatomical theater, towards Subject 7, sensing that the key might lie within his trapped rage or the history of Finch's gruesome practices. Gathering her courage, she ascended the grand staircase once more, the steps groaning ominously. The upper corridor was colder than before, the air thick with anticipation. The double doors to the theater stood slightly ajar, just as she'd first found them. Pushing the door open, she shone her flashlight inside. The vast space was silent, the dissection table gleaming faintly under the weak skylight. But something was wrong. The air was incredibly heavy, thick with the smell of decay, chemicals, and something else. Hot wax and ozone. The low hum was stronger here, vibrating through the floorboards. Her beam swept across the tiers of seats, finding them empty. It moved down into the pit. The anatomical models stood undisturbed. The figure of Subject 7 remained impassive against the wall. Then the beam hit the corner opposite Subject 7, a space previously occupied by dusty crates and discarded surgical drapes. It wasn't empty now. A shape huddled there, large and indistinct in the gloom. A mound of something. Eleanor approached the edge of the pit, her light held steady, heart hammering against her ribs. The mound shifted. Slowly, hideously, it began to uncoil. It was a grotesque mass, vaguely humanoid in its upright posture but utterly alien in composition. Melted, congealed wax, swirls of pale flesh tones, sickly yellows, bruised purples formed its bulk, fused with dust, grime, scraps of fabric, and rusted metal fragments. And embedded within the hideous matrix, like obscene jewels, were dozens upon dozens of glass eyes. Eyes of every color, reflecting the flashlight beam with a terrifying, multifaceted glare. Blue eyes, brown eyes, gray eyes, many she recognized from figures smashed or missing downstairs, others unfamiliar. They swiveled, not in unison, but independently, creating a nauseating ripple across the creature's surface. The oculax, the amalgamation. Celia's Croft's illicitly gathered eyes, Dubois' wax, Finch's ambition, the collective suffering of the museum, all fused into this monstrous entity. It rose to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, dripping wax and emitting the low, resonant hum. It had no mouth, no discernible features beyond the horrific constellation of watching eyes. Eleanor stumbled back, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The creature turned its entire upper mass towards her, the dozens of eyes focusing. The hum intensified, vibrating in her teeth. It took a step forward, heavy, shuffling, leaving a trail of sticky wax residue on the floor. Panic overwhelmed research. Eleanor spun, scrambling back up the steep theater steps. Behind her, the oculax lumbered forward, its movement surprisingly fast for its bulk. The sound of its shuffling gait and the strange hum filled the theater. She burst out into the corridor, slamming the heavy doors shut. They shuddered violently as the creature impacted them from the other side. A thick, waxy substance began to ooze from beneath the doors. The eyes. She could almost feel them, dozens of unseen gazes pressing through the wood, searching for her. She fled down the corridor, down the grand staircase, the creature's hum seeming to follow her, resonating through the building itself. The main hall offered no sanctuary. The reflected watcher flickered in the glass cabinets, its expression now one of triumphant hunger. The sealed door to the gallery of affliction bulged slightly, the sound of skittering louder within. The horrors were no longer separate. They were connected, feeding each other, culminating in the monstrous oculax now trying to break free from the theater. Croft's warning, Dubois' despair, Subject 7's rage, the weeping figure's sorrow, they weren't just echoes anymore. They had formed a body, and it was hunting her. Escape seemed impossible. The entire museum had become the monster. Chapter 9. Eyes Wide Shut. Trapped. The word hammered in Eleanor's skull as she stood trembling in the main hall. Behind her, the heavy thump, thump, thump of the oculax pounding against the theater doors echoed from above. To her left, the sealed door to the gallery of affliction groaned, the wood splintering slightly near the bottom as the tear streakers presumably searched for egress. Ahead, the main entrance seemed impossibly far, and the reflected watcher grinned maliciously from the glass panels beside it, its form rippling with anticipation. Panic threatened to paralyze her. Think Croft's words trapped the last sight. Subject Seven's rage focused, potent. Dubois' despair a counterpoint. What was the key? The pounding from above intensified. A loud crack signaled splintering wood. The oculax would break through soon. Her eyes darted around the hall, searching for anything, a weapon, an escape route. Her gaze fell upon the display case containing Finch's surgical tools, the rusty scalpels, saws, clamps. Beside it, another case held plaster phrenology busts, mapping the supposed regions of the brain. And next to that, a fire extinguisher. Heavy brass coated in dust but potentially functional. An idea sparked, desperate and dangerous. She ran towards it, ignoring the reflected watcher mimicking her movements with predatory glee. She hefted the extinguisher. It was heavy, awkward. The pounding from the theater doors grew louder, closer. Her gaze snapped back towards the staircase. If the oculax was the amalgamation of the eyes, the suffering, what was its core, its weakness? Perhaps it wasn't brute force. Perhaps it was focus, concentration. Subject 7. His rage was specific, directed. Could it override the chaos of the oculax? Decision made. Alina turned away from the main entrance and sprinted towards the grand staircase, towards the approaching horror. She raced upwards, the steps groaning. The theater doors splintered further, waxy tendrils probing through the cracks. She reached the landing just as the doors burst open. The oculax filled the frame, its myriad eyes swiveling towards her, the hum rising to a deafening pitch. It lumbered forward. Alina didn't aim for the creature's mass. She hoisted the extinguisher and aimed its nozzle towards the other end of the corridor, towards the closed door of what she presumed was Finch's study, or perhaps Dubois' workshop. She squeezed the handle. A thick cloud of chemical foam erupted, momentarily obscuring the corridor. She didn't wait to see the oculax's reaction. She plunged into the opposite direction, back towards the now open theater entrance. Inside, the pit was cast in deeper shadow. She scrambled down the tiers, heading directly for the figure of Subject 7 against the far wall. Its pale gray eyes seemed to glow faintly in the gloom. "I know what they did to you," she gasped, standing before the impassive wax face. "Finch, Croft, they didn't just take your body, they took your sight, your fury." She reached out, her hand trembling, and pressed her palm flat against the figure's cold, waxy chest. "Focus it," she urged, unsure if she was talking to the figure, the spirit within the eyes, or herself. "Focus your rage, not on me, on them, on Finch, on the thing made from his cruelty." Behind her, the oculax entered the theater. Its hum momentarily muted as its eyes adjusted, searching through the lingering extinguisher foam that drifted in from the corridor. Alina pressed harder against the wax figure. She closed her own eyes, concentrating, trying to recall the blinding rage she'd felt when first encountering Subject 7's gaze. Rage, injustice, violation. A surge of intense cold radiated from the wax figure, numbing her hand, spreading up her arm. The air crackled. A low growl, filled with centuries of contained fury, emanated not from the figure but from the very air around it. The oculax located her. It turned its multi-eyed mass, starting its advance across the theater pit. Suddenly, the figure of Subject 7 jerked. Its head snapped towards the approaching oculax. The pale gray eyes flared with an internal white light. The growl intensified into a focused beam of pure psychic anger, slamming into the oculax. The monstrous amalgamation staggered. Its hum faltered, dissolving into a cacophony of shrieks, dozens of voices trapped within the eyes, momentarily disrupted. The oculax flailed, wax slewing off its form, eyes rolling wildly. It seemed confused, attacked from an unexpected internal source. Subject 7's spectral fury poured out, relentless. The oculax stumbled backwards, crashing into the dissection table, sending rusted instruments flying. It raised its malformed limbs as if to ward off the invisible assault. Alina seized the chance. Keeping low, she scrambled away from Subject 7, circling the chaotic scene. She headed not for the exit, but towards the small, rusted tin box she'd found in the archive, the one containing the spare eyes, which she'd left on a dusty bench. The oculax under Subject 7's psychic barrage seemed to be imploding. The embedded eyes turned inward, their light extinguishing. The wax convulsed, contracting. With a final, wet tearing sound, the creature collapsed into a grotesque, twitching heap of wax, grime, and sightless glass orbs. Silence descended, broken only by Alina's ragged breathing and a final, fatting growl from the direction of the Subject 7 figure. Its eyes dimmed, returning to their flat, gray state. Alina reached the bench, grabbed the tin box. She looked back at the quiescent figure of Subject 7, then at the disgusting pile that was the oculax. Had she stopped it, or merely paused it? A faint scraping sound from the corridor reminded her the other horrors were still active. The weeping figure's sorrow still seeped. Croft's shadow likely lingered. The reflected watcher. She carefully avoided looking at any polished surface. She clutched the tin box. These eyes. Perhaps the key wasn't destruction, but containment. She couldn't cleanse the museum, not alone, but maybe she could close some of the windows. Slowly, cautiously, Alina began moving through the theater, then the corridor, her flashlight beam carefully directed away from reflective surfaces. She descended the stairs. The main hall was silent now, the door to the gallery of affliction still shuddering faintly. The oculax's defeat seemed to have quieted the building, for now. She reached the massive front doors, the iron key heavy in her hand. Turning, it felt different this time. Not opening, but sealing. She stepped out into the gray twilight of Hemlock Lane, pulling the immense door shut behind her. The screech of protesting wood echoed in the narrow courtyard, followed by the heavy thud of the bolt sliding home. She leaned against the door, the cold iron chilling her through her coat. Inside, the silence felt temporary, the darkness watchful. She hadn't won. She had survived barely. She had stirred the nest, confronted one nightmare, but the source, the building itself, saturated with pain and Finch's ambition, remained. She clutched the tin box tighter. What horrors resided in these spare eyes? And what would happen when the museum inevitably drew someone else into its morbid embrace? As she walked away from number 13, leaving the anatomical theater to its tormented slumber, Alina couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't over. In the reflection of a grimy puddle on Hemlock Lane, she thought she saw a pair of pale gray eyes watching her go.